Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Julia Lave-Johnston, and I am the president of the California chapter of the American Planning Association. And we're very pleased today to be joining with the Sacramento Valley Section of the APA California chapter to bring you this webinar called Planning Through the COVID-19 Crisis, how we are adapting in these uncertain times. So I really believe that planners can be leaders in their communities during crises. We have the problem-solving skills that are necessary. We know how to solve problems really well. And so what we're trying to do with APA California is find ways to support you during this time so you can be those leaders. We want to help you be resilient personally and professionally. So we're hoping that today's webinar will give you some best practices and ideas. We're also hoping that you can provide us with some feedback about what you need from us during this time. APA California is really only here to support you as planners and as our members. So thank you very much for joining today. I hope you find it interesting, and I hope that you'll reach out and let us know how we can continue to support you during these very interesting times. And I'm going to turn it over to Yasi Sarbian, the section director for the Sacramento Valley Section APA.
Thank you so much, Julia. Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. As Julia said, my name is Yasi Sarbian. I am the Sacramento Valley Section Director, and I'm very excited to be moderating today's panel. We have a really wonderful, great group of panelists here today. Some of them include Tom Pace, the Interim Director of the City of Sacramento Development Department. We have Daniel Cucci, JD, a Senior Associate with Abbott and Kinderman Incorporated from the private perspective. We have Wendy Novak, a Principal with PlaceWorks. And finally, from the technology perspective, we have Daniel Friedman, a partner with Remoter Consulting Group. Before I invite our panelists to come up one at a time to share their unique perspectives to how their subsector is adapting to COVID-19 during these challenging times, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Hopefully you all should be able to see in the little menu bar, which for me, it is off to the right-hand side. For you, it may be located elsewhere. We have some handouts that are provided for you. We have an agenda PDF that for some folks may be working when you click on it. For some, it may not. If you are having challenges with accessing the agenda, you can click on the Google link that has been provided in the chat below. We also have 2 more documents provided, including speaker bios, if you wish to learn more about our wonderful speakers. I also would like to note that this recording is, this webinar, I got ahead of myself, this webinar is being recorded, so if you do need to step away or if you need to run off to another meeting, don't worry, we have recorded it and we will provide it very soon. You can also tell your friends who unfortunately could not make it today that it is available for them to view. I also want to mention that if you have any questions for any of our panelists during this time, I recommend you use the questions feature that is available in the little menu bar. Please try to include the name of the presenter to whom you want to ask your question. And in the last 15 minutes of today's 1-hour-long webinar, we will invite the panelists back up for our Q&A session. I think that is it in terms of all the housekeeping items. I would like to start us off by welcoming Tom Pace, the Interim Director for the City of Sacramento's Community Development Department.
Thank you, Yasi. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to talk about a couple of challenges I've seen from the public sector perspective, and also some opportunities, and then I'll finish up with a big picture sense of where we're going from here. First, 2 challenge areas. One of those relates to our disadvantaged communities. As a public agency, when we think about doing our public outreach, for those who may not have web access, it can be a real challenge for us to reach these communities. Right now in Sacramento, we're updating our general plan and we're preparing our state-required environmental justice element, which requires us to make a special effort to reach out to disadvantaged communities. We also have 2 specific plans that include EJ communities within their boundaries And we're working on a citywide inclusive economic development strategy that has an emphasis on disadvantaged communities. We're also trying to assist some of our low-income workers' need for childcare. Another challenge area is the learning curve. Quickly learning how to use these different video conferencing platforms like Microsoft Teams, WebEx, Zoom, GoToMeeting, and Skype, all of which we use. Managing staff remotely, learning how to over-communicate to compensate for in-person communication that's missing during these difficult times that we face. And also learning how to conduct online public hearings, dealing with the legal questions, the format questions, whether to allow the public to show on the video or to call in or only to text communications or comments, those logistical questions, training of staff, training our commissioners, training our council members, and training the public how to use these technologies to participate in public hearings. So on the flip side, I'd like to talk about some opportunities relating to these areas and others. With respect to disadvantaged communities, we see an opportunity to reach these groups using lower tech solutions like telephone and smartphone options. So there could be, for example, telephone communications where people could listen to recordings or respond to questionnaires on the phone. We also envision using videos that people can watch on their smartphone and apps where they can respond to questions, provide input, and ask questions using their smartphones. On the childcare front, in the city of Sacramento, we have been able to repurpose some of our recreation staff to provide childcare for first responders and essential workers. So that has been a plus. As they've been removed from doing some of their day-to-day recreational functions, they can provide that kind of a service. On the learning curve side of things, staff have adjusted pretty well to this new tech-heavy way of working. In fact, we may not be able to get a couple of our over 65 staffers to ever come back to the office. They're enjoying it so much. So I've been very pleased with the ability of our group to very quickly learn these technologies and apply them on a daily basis. From the environment point of view, we need to figure out how to make VMT reduction permanent so that we can gain that cleaner air, the fewer traffic collisions, and the quieter neighborhoods that we're enjoying right now. And on a personal note, I really am enjoying the greater flexibility that I have with telework, reducing unnecessary in-person transactions in our building. And really on that line, we've been able to use an entirely online method of permitting and application processing, which we are finding to be a lot more efficient. We're also doing entirely video building inspection. So we've got basically an entirely electronic approach right now to our planning and building functions at the city of Sacramento. And I'm hoping we can continue that trend in the post-COVID environment. And now for the big picture take. Social distancing, I believe, is a problem for urbanism. Urbanity is all about people coming together. Cities are humankind's greatest invention, and cities are what make innovation possible. People need face-to-face interaction. Even in Silicon Valley, a place that's all about tech, investors want their companies close by. I know this firsthand because we've tried to recruit a number of them to the Sacramento area, and it's hard to do because those investors really want to have that face-to-face, hands-on interaction with their companies that they're investing in. So, thinking about all of this, I have the following takeaways. I don't see permanent social distancing as a viable or desirable scenario. Obviously, we need to take reasonable precautions both right now and think about what kind of permanent precautions would be needed going forward. But we do need to find ways to continue social contact in public spaces. The public realm needs people to enliven it. And so now, for my final point, we need to figure out how to make public transit work in this new dynamic. Public transit is still the most space-efficient way to move large numbers of people, and as our urban areas grow, we need to have this be a part of the mobility toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Really great insights and a really great perspective on what the public sector is doing in response to COVID, and acknowledging the reality for planners as we head into the future. Thank you again. Turning to the private perspective, I'd like to invite Wendy Novak with PlaceWorks to come and share her perspective on both public engagement and what the private sector is seeing for us planners.
Great, thanks Yasi. Thanks everyone. It's good to virtually see you. In my role with PlaceWorks, I work on general plans and specific plans most of the time. We work with public sector clients, we work with private clients, and I also wear another hat as a national ambassador for the organization called the International Association of Public Participation. So public outreach is one of my big passions, if you will. So I would like to touch on three things really. Tom kicked it off with us looking at cities, the city perspective. That's the front line, right? You guys are out there coordinating with the public, and then my role as a consultant is to support you. And so what we're finding with our different clients that we're working with is that everybody is adjusting differently, and we are having to adapt the same way with our clients. So for example, talking about general plans, we're working with the city of Moore Park, and they're kicking off their general plan right now. And we've been really looking at, we had a whole outreach program set up for them and a work program on how the tasks were going to work. And inevitably, a lot of those now have to change from in-person events to virtual. And so we're taking things in phases, if you will, and trying to see how we can organize that with them so we can bite off little pieces and reorganize it in a virtual way, but still create connection with community. So for example, one of the things they were afraid of is looking at is this really an opportune time to be kicking off a general plan? Should we wait a little bit and see how things roll out? But the way that the staff has been looking at it, and the city manager and council, is that this is actually a great time because it could be a tool and a document that helps the community to navigate forward in a time where they're having to adapt and do new things that we haven't done before. And so now when we're looking at the outreach for them, we also have to look at, normally we would have workshops that could last 2 or 3 hours in length. Well, nobody is going to have the patience or the tolerance to sit in front of their laptop for 2 or 3 hours. So now we need to look at breaking up those work programs and those engagement points into smaller bite-sized pieces. And so what you'll find is there's probably going to be more engagement, but in smaller, shorter bits. So that's something to think about when you're looking at your outreach. The other part is when we're working with communities, it's like, how do you create trust with a community when you're looking at them through a little square on a computer screen? I mean, it's already tough enough when we have really controversial issues that were coming up and you're in front of someone. At least you have a group and you have a facilitator that's helping to referee. It's a lot different dynamic when you are in a screen and you're either having to mute somebody or put them in a waiting room because they're being inappropriate, or just to get those relationships going. I mean, the hardest part about collaboration is that usually you're trying to get people off of their positions. It's either this way or this way, and get them to collaborate and talk about their interests. So maybe the ways that they would approach something aren't the same, but you can say the things that you guys find most important are, so let's find those in between. So if you're not sitting at a table and collaborating and in getting into it and rolling up your sleeves all together, it just doesn't have the feel as it does when you're in person. So, we're really looking at ways, especially like in Moore Park, they want to engender that sense of community. So we're looking at creative ways of storytelling and working with the community to say what's most important to them so that we can help celebrate that and that the community can see that get rolled out. We're also looking at coordinating with our private property owners. We have seen still a strong interest in redevelopment of properties, but now what we're also hearing is, okay, the step back and going, well, so many people have been working from home. maybe we need to start shifting what our residential looks like. You know, for a long time, we had home offices and then it was extra space and nobody really needed it, so we downshifted. But now that everybody is coming back and having to work from home and we're seeing that that's possible, we might start to see a shift in product type. We might start to see a shift in where, if office spaces are grouped and they're smaller, or maybe they're more communal office spaces. But definitely it's going to be an interesting world in trying to figure out this balance of, you know, housing and working space and what that looks like now and what community looks like because we can work from home. So how do we get to interact with one another? And, you know, in going back to I think the interesting point about outreach and doing, you know, environmental justice is one of our big priorities that we've been, you know, working through with communities now, is that how do we get to those communities where you're supposed to go where they are and work and connect with them the way that they like to be engaged. And so now, you know, we're really having to look at, okay, well, if people don't have access to internet, if they don't have computers, what do we do? Now, the upside is a lot of people have cell phones. And so really seeing if we can engage with, you know, that sort of digital workplace is, you know, is going to be something that we're really looking at heavily. So, you know, I think there's a lot of things going on with our cities. It's, you know, trying to see what those processes are, how their staff are working, what we can do to support things. The other thing we're looking at with the cities are, you know, if we're having to make adjustments in budgets and other things so that we can keep the departments running, are we putting a focus on grant funded projects where they know the funds are available? How do you shift those work plans around so you can get that work, continue to have that moving while you're looking at department priorities? And then we're looking at that engagement with the community. How do we connect with them? How do we provide meaning and show up with them so that they get used to the virtual world? And then the last part is the property owners, keeping an eye on the way that these new products are coming out and the way that we're going to have to adapt to this new lifestyle. I really do think that our focus on housing and office is going to change. Some of that design is going to be looked at more closely. And so, you know, maybe those are opportunities for communities to when we're looking at general plan updates and areas of change, those may be those places that they could do that. So those are my insights for now. I have lots more on outreach and other details when it comes to engagement. And so I think I can hand it off now. Yasi?
Thank you so much, Wendy. Really great insights. And I think the biggest takeaway I'm getting is that even during this challenging time, it's important to remember we need to be inclusive and equitable when it comes to our planning. We cannot throw that aside in the middle of this crisis. And in fact, we may need it now more than ever. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over. I kind of jumped around a little bit, just keeping everybody on the toes. So I'm going to jump back up to Dan Cucci, a senior associate with Abbott and Kinderman, for the legal perspective. Take it away, Dan.
Thanks, Yasi. Thanks everybody for coming. My name's Dan Cucci. I'm a former planner, now a lawyer doing land use and real estate, local government agency work. I thought what I could do for you is to help you sort of navigate. I mean, every single day it feels like the legal landscape is changing about what particular agencies, what they can and can't do, and processing and you know, and doing all the things that you normally have to do, meetings, notices, all that stuff. And so I thought first I could give you a little sort of walkthrough about kind of the current lay of the land, at least as of today, and can't confirm that it'll be that way tomorrow, but at least for today we know what we have. And then after, as we get to the end, I can sort of walk through a couple of ideas that I've been kicking around about some things that local agencies can consider doing in this sort of current crisis to both think about, you know, the current environment as well as, you know, how they may perceive the needs to address sort of the post-stay-at-home order world and, you know, leading in a recovery sort of path. And so I'll start off. Most of you probably already know about this one. This is the executive order that was issued by the governor on March 12th, and that's the Brown Act suspension. So I suspect most agencies, I'll do this one fairly quickly, are fully aware of their options under the Brown Act suspension, where folks can ultimately hold hearings really by teleconference or webinar or really kind of any sort of other non-in-person method. But you got to always remember that you must still have at least one publicly accessible location that would allow people to show up and provide comments. So, what's sort of interesting about that is it doesn't actually mean that you have to have a council member or a board member there. It may even just be a room where they could then utilize some sort of piece of technology to comment on, but that is a requirement under the executive order, and so we want to make sure that you've sort of recognized that in the processes that you're adopting. But to sort of illustrate the lay of the land changing seemingly every day, even just as much as early as last week, we had yet another executive order by the governor. This was on the 22nd of this month, so it was, I believe that's 8 days ago. And this changed the way that you handle CEQA posting requirements. So whether you have a notice of availability, notices of exemption, or notices of termination, normally you would post that, at the, your agency offices. You probably send it to the recorder's office. And in this instance, all of those existing requirements are suspended for 60 days from April 22nd. And now, however, you are required to still post those materials on your agency's website. You also need to submit it electronically to SequaNet, and you also must implement this outreach to known individuals and entities that are interested in the project. So, I mean, I've sort of been chatting with agencies that I work with about what does that really mean, outreach. I mean, I tend to think of it as if you have email access, or you could do mail notices. Really, the idea is to, if you have lists of people who already shown interest, maybe they've done comments, on a project, or perhaps they've just sent you an email saying, hey, what's going on with this project? I think a wider net is always better than a smaller one. And as well as you consider all those folks who've sent in to, say, the city clerk or the board clerk that they want copies of notice hearings on various projects. I would try to grab as many of those folks together when you sort of figure out how you're going to meet this outreach requirement to ensure that you're doing what's required. Another sort of important part about last week's executive order that may have gotten overlooked is the tribal consultation deadlines requirement. So in this instance, the tribal consultation, normally it's a 30-day deadline for tribes to respond to your notice that you're doing a project that would triggers them having an opportunity to request consultation on that project. Well, this executive order also suspended that requirement for 60 days. But the important part is to remember what it does is it suspends their deadline for getting back to you, not any other deadline about whether or not you need to send it to them or how long you have. So really, this is an opportunity for the tribes to have a little extra time to get back to the agency. And so agency should build in sort of that extra time in waiting for, to get feedback from the tribes that might have an interest, that they desire to have some consultation. It's also important to know that it's not just the governor's office of the state that is weighing in on certain timelines and issues. The Judicial Council of California, it's ultimately headed by the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, issued an emergency rule number 9 on April 6th, 2020, that told the statute of limitations for really all civil litigation. But for planners, what matters for that is that would include any CEQA litigation, any planning and zoning lawsuits. And the rule says that tolling lasts until 90 days after the governor lifts the state of emergency. So basically, since April 6th, what that means is that every day that goes by doesn't count towards the statute of limitations that normally apply to filing lawsuits against the agency. So for instance, if you say you approved the project and then filed an NOD before this all started, say maybe on April 1st, and so you had a 30-day CEQA deadline for filing a lawsuit. So the tolling starting on April 6th would mean that only 5 or 6 days, you have to take a look, but assume 5 days had passed. But now every day that goes by until 90 days after that state of emergency ends doesn't count. So the clock isn't running right now for anybody who wants to file. And so what does that mean? It means like a lot of the claims for agencies are really very short. CEQA is 30 or 35, depending on whether it's a NOD or a notice of exemption. And then of course, general planning and zoning claims are 90 days. And that rule really has a really important reason why the statute was written that way. And it's really about this sort of principle about having really short statute of limitations to promote finality of project decisions. Well, this order really greatly expands the length of time, not just during while everybody's hunkered down. It adds a lot of extra time even after it's theoretically all over. And so the California APA, AEP, the League of Cities, CSAC, and RCRC they're all a lot of entities who address their members' interests, such as yours. I've written to the Judicial Council asking for the council to consider modifying that rule to address the statute of limitations issues that it created for CEQA and planning and zoning. So we'll want to keep an eye on the effect of that. So in the meantime, you need to recognize that if you've had this decision out there, the deadline for filing a lawsuit is still hanging out there. But there are also some other issues that actually haven't been addressed. So it's important to know what this sort of COVID-19 environment hasn't done and what it means for your sort of day-to-day operations. The Permit Streamlining Act, the Housing Accountability Act, the Subdivision Map Act, your ADU processing deadlines, or your CEQA deadlines, responding to Public Records Act, all that is technically still in effect, and all those deadlines are still applicable. So there's, of course, I'm aware that the League of Cities and I believe the California APA have written letters to the governor asking for him to address these issues, given the challenges that it's created at the agency level about meeting all these deadlines. But technically, you should be aware that these deadlines still apply, and so you want to be mindful of that and recognize that that can be an issue if you're not meeting certain deadlines. We talked about a lot about what the state is doing and what the Judicial Council is doing, but there are some things that I think you can do that you don't have to wait for the state to act. Some things I've been thinking about is local agencies control land use permitting. They get to decide how long things last, before they expire. So you could consider blanket permit extension ordinances. So perhaps you want to do an ordinance because you have staff, it's difficult to work, it's difficult to get things done. So you go ahead and adopt an ordinance that extends every existing permit's expiration date for, say, 90 days. And just so you can sort of, not have these sort of issues create the need to hold hearings that maybe you don't really need because it's not really all that controversial. And so that can be an option that agencies can take up. Maps, that's another interesting one because deadlines are actually statutory. So on some level, you would think that locals can't do anything about that. But actually, you do have one option that could address that. You could adopt an ordinance that does a simple form development agreement for anybody who has a map that might expire sort of during in the next, say 6 months, and you can control adding length of time. And so doing a simple form development agreement could let local agencies have the ability to give life to a project. You could consider temporarily moving the approval process for certain permits to staff level review. There could be a value to that. You might go through your systems and notice that you got a lot of permits that just really never drive any controversy. And so perhaps that could be a good way to sort of eliminate unnecessary public hearings while still having an opportunity for people to comment as necessary. And of course, you can always build in the opportunity to sort of kick a controversial project back up to the commission or the council if that's required. And then speaking with, sort of going on with Wendy's comment, I think this is a great time to reallocate resources to long-range planning issues. To the extent that you have space and need to find opportunity for work. Remember VMT policies, that deadline's coming real fast and it's not changing either. That's July 1, 2020. You're gonna need to figure out how you're gonna address VMT. A lot of places still have housing element deadlines coming up. You have to update your ADU ordinances from the changes that went into effect on January 1. And a lot of agencies are likely to deal with these, and so that could be another thing to not to forget is something for you to address. So that'll end it for me, and I'm happy to take questions later when we're ready. Thanks, Yasi.
Thank you so much, Dan. As always, really great insights. I know I was personally scribbling furiously because I have a few documents myself that are nearing the public outreach phase and public distribution. So it's interesting to adapt, and it's interesting to see from the legal perspective what they are doing in light of these challenging and new times. So I'd like to move on to our final panelist, Daniel Friedman, a partner with Remoter Consulting Group. Daniel, why don't you explain to us what the technology sector with respect to planning and public engagement, what that has been like in light of COVID-19.
Hi, thanks so much for everyone for coming out to this webinar, and thank you so much to the American Planning Association for having me speak to you all. My name is Daniel Friedman. I'm a partner at Remoter Consulting Group, and I'm here to talk today about remote work, trends, and tools. So what are we going to talk about in this talk? Just the trends and the tools, and I'm going to hope to also highlight some of the great points that were made by the other panelists during this seminar. Trends in remote work. We'll talk about short and long-term trends in remote work. There certainly are some changes that have happened recently and suddenly that need to be dealt with, but also there are longer-term trends that have been happening for decades. We'll talk about some data from California specifically that's up to the month, and also trends from the countrywide. In the second part of the talk, I'll talk about a few of the categories of tools for remote work. In this short presentation, the goal will not be to tell you what the best tool is, because that's something that comes down to each individual team's situation. Rather, I'll sketch out some ideas about how you can simplify your tool use and provide worksheets that you could use to improve your tooling. We'll talk about hardware and software components, and we'll talk about platforms for engagement specifically, which was brought up by multiple of the speakers. So let's get right into it. What are the trends related to remote work? A 2020 report from flexjobs.com found that 44% increases in remote work had occurred over the last 5 years in America, and over 159% increases had occurred within the last 12 years. These are some major increases in work. These increases in remote work are being reflected across all sectors, from academic to industrial, nonprofit, and governmental areas. Who is actually contributing to this trend? And the short answer is everyone, but we can actually provide a little bit more interesting data on that. And to tell you a little bit more about who is contributing to this trend, we can look at a 2015 paper from the Quarterly Journal of Economics by Bloom et al. That also has some nice, interesting information about ways to increase productivity in remote teams. The graph that I'm going to show you comes from the 2010 American Census data. And what this graph looks at is, as a function of wage decile, that is 10 percentiles of wage earners, from the lowest wage earners to the highest wage earners, it asks what fraction were working from home. Remember, this data was from 2010 survey. In 2010, it was already apparent that remote work was more common proportionally among the very lowest as well as the very highest wage earners. We can imagine why that might be, and also it's interesting to think about in 2020 how with our upcoming census we might be able to get a more accurate picture. Certainly the numbers overall of remote work have changed, but it will be interesting and also extremely important to understand how these trends influence people in all socioeconomic backgrounds, ages, skill sets, and ability to connect to the internet. We can actually go into even more recent data. I'd like to discuss a paper that was posted on April 8th this year entitled COVID-19 and remote work, an early look at the US data. What this paper did was they asked 25,000 Americans who had been working 1 month previously, and they asked these people, we have one question for you. Do you continue to commute to work? Do you used to commute but now work from home? Or do you used to work and still do? Additionally, they found out whether workers were laid off or had been furloughed. The answers might be shocking to some. They found that of those who had been employed 4 weeks earlier, 34.1% reported that they were commuting previously and now are working from home. In addition, 11.8% reported being laid off or furloughed. These are massive amounts of people who have been laid off. However, when you combine the fractions of people who used to work from home and still do, which is about 15%, with a fraction of people who used to commute but now work from home, which is that 34.1%, we have an estimate of about 50% of Americans who might be working from home right now. This is serious numbers. We can actually look at this state by state to get a better picture. This next picture on the bottom right will be the fraction by state of Americans who are working remotely. We can see that depending on the state, we range from that 20% dark purple to almost 50% of workers working remotely by state. Let's also talk a little bit about age-wise, who is likely to be transitioning to remote work. The study found that younger people were more likely to switch to remote work. This was reflected by the fact that workers older than 55 were more likely to continue commuting rather than switching to work from home. However, workers that were 55 and older were also more significantly likely to have started out in the category, I used to work from home and still do. This information is in figure 4 of the paper. The takeaway here is that there may be some statistical differences between different types of workers as far as their previous situations, as well as how the recent crisis has affected them. However, across the board, this is a moment of extreme urgency and change for a large fraction of our population. And just to provide a little data on California specifically, the estimate was that 30% of Californians were continuing to commute, and 35% of people who were previously commuting are now working from home. And the data for all states is in figure 7 of the paper. In the second part of this talk, I'd just like to briefly cover a few of the tools that are used for remote work. Tools are technology, whether hardware or software, that help us get the job done. This definition of tools, the idea that tools help us get work done, will clarify things. If a tool is not helping you get the work done, or you think a better tool exists for the job, that's a signal that you should switch tools, because if it's not helping you, it's not the right tool. Additionally, in this short talk, I don't have time to go into all the pros and cons of different platforms. We can just lay out some of the broad categories, such as low-tech supplies and office hardware, high-tech hardware, such as phones, computers, and laptops, and software. These are the things that run on digital hardware. For specific emphasis on tools that are useful for public engagement, please check the handouts of this seminar. You'll find that we've prepared a PDF that has comparisons of different video chatting platforms. Especially important and mentioned by multiple of the speakers today was that not everyone has access to a computer. And so software for virtual public engagement that relies on smartphone-only applications may be more accessible and therefore inclusive. Let's just briefly go over a few of the categories of software and a few tips and tricks that you could use to reduce the complexity of the software you use. What are the tools and why do you need each one? For detailed comparisons, here's a list of sites that provide head versus head comparisons of different software platforms. Again, there isn't enough time in this short webinar to go into details because everyone's situation is unique. Let's just talk about a few of the general categories. First are email and chat. Email and chat are used to exchange short and long messages, either in a sort of scrolling or in a threaded topical way. Everyone is familiar with email and chat. File sharing is something that is also crucial. We've seen just in this webinar multiple forms of file sharing software being used. Audio-visual meeting software is especially important for virtual public engagement, especially if live feedback with constituents is to be expected. This brings us to the fourth category of software that are also important for those in the logistics and planning fields, registration and engagement software. A lot of the details of audiovisual platforms and registration and engagement platforms are detailed in the handout that we provide. One last category that makes sense as sort of an outgroup are task-specific software. These are the software that help you get the job done, but don't necessarily fit into the other 4 categories. This could include statistics software, graphic design software, or video editing software. We've left some extra space so that you can fill out what you use in your own teams. Also, you'll find it interesting as you fill out. Do you have any redundant software use? Is there anything that you could remove? For example, an old email address that would help you close out a whole platform, or a single person who you message with only on a certain platform? Ask this person to switch messaging platforms, at least in their interactions with you, so that you can simplify your tech stack. Always be aware of the security risks as well as the cognitive load of simply having too many software. And that also reminds me of the points about learning curve that were made earlier in this seminar. Ask if your team has a best practice for each of these areas. There might be cases where your team uses different software to deal with the same problem. For example, if 2 people are at different levels of skill in graphic design, they might use different software. That's fine. However, if 2 people on your team or you and your constituents use different software for sharing files, chat, or audiovisual meetings, it can be a big headache, and I'm sure we've all experienced that in the last few weeks. I hope that you use this sheet to list and take a thorough accounting of which software platforms you use, and then, given the constraints and availabilities of your own situation, come to a solution that works for you. That's all for my section, and I look to hear from your questions in the next section of our talk when we'll bring all the panelists back on. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Really great insights and a really great perspective. At this time, I would like to invite, as Daniel said, I'd like to invite the rest of our panelists back on to turn their cameras back on, and we will begin our question and answer portion. I'd also like to invite Jenny Tickler, who has been diligently managing the questions that have been coming in. So I'm just going to turn it over to Jenny now and see if we have any questions for our panelists.
We do. We have several questions. The first one is for Tom. Tom, given this situation is likely to last at least a couple of years, assuming a vaccine happens, how do we work with older and other sensitive communities? Ignoring the social issues with them, how do we get their input? It'll probably have to be almost entirely virtual. City phone apps an option?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And obviously, it will depend on the access that the particular population has to technology, which is probably related to socioeconomic conditions or even the neighborhood in which they live in terms of the ability of them to connect to the internet and use broadband resources. But a significant segment of older Americans and certainly here in Sacramento, older Sacramentans do use technology quite extensively and are quite comfortable with viewing podcasts or participating in video conferencing. So I think that certainly is an element that's available for people. And it actually, there's been a lot of concern about not having in-person meetings, but the flip side is that having electronic meetings creates access for a lot of people for whom it was too difficult to physically appear at a public meeting.
Thanks, Tom. Wendy, we have something for you. Wendy, good comments about how design may change. How do we deal with fixed occupancy requirements and prohibition of business uses of residential? WFH has been common for years in the fields that don't require customers to visit, but what about if you have clients visit? Does that require special permits, even for low volume situations? How does it change parking requirements? How does it change how new homes are laid out? This could get interesting.
That is a loaded question of a lot of things. I think this is what I'm seeing is that for a long time, we've had our codes and we know exactly what they are, and this is how we apply them, and that's how everybody else has been applying them, and so it's consistent. But as we've been adjusting to this new world that we're living in, it's going to be really interesting to see which communities embrace these things first and try them out. I mean, I think that's what we're starting to find too, even with outreach, even with all of us working from home. I mean, some people have worked from home for forever and have this down, but the majority of us don't. And so we're all trying to figure it out as we go. So here are my 2 cents on it. And I don't know that we have a crystal ball and we're going to figure it out all right away, because, you know, it is a challenge. We have seen even just in existing neighborhoods where when you start having, you know, more people living in homes than they used to, you know, you have parking issues. So now if you start having people visit, I don't know if it's going to be, you know, a thing where it's like, okay, do we have driveways? There's so many different conditions, I guess, that it might be something where we're looking at, you know, where Dan was talking about different like streamlining for permitting. It's like taking a look at it again and going, hey, we are working from home more. This is a thing now we're seeing businesses shift to. So we do need to spend some time to look at that and go, what allowances and tolerances are we going to have? Because guess what? Everybody now is working from home, and even the communities need to adjust to our new world. But then we're going to have less traffic and less people traveling around. And so, you know, I don't know. And there were so many questions in there. I'm not sure I'm hitting on all of them, but my guess is that we're going to be taking a closer look at some of these regulations, and that they might morph and change a little bit to help accommodate our new normal. It's going to have to.
I was going to add, you know, you as an agency, you have a lot of discretion about how you want to regulate certain things, at least when it comes from the use perspective and the design perspective. But there probably are going to be some challenges related to building code, maybe ADA compliance, that, you know, you can change your regs all you want, but if you are ultimately triggering those issues, you know, they may become a real headache. So that's where the state will probably need to step in. But I think these are great questions that ultimately are going to need to be answered, because I think there will be some changes, I think, in the way work is done, in a way that are going to bring these things to the forefront. And it's probably going to require a collaboration from local agencies and their desires to do certain things, and then the need for the state to address those changes effectively from a sort of health and safety statewide impact.
Thank you, Dan. There's actually a question for you. It sounds like you would recommend that we have a place such as our lobby where we could televise our public hearings and also allow a mechanism for public to submit comments at that location, such as a computer, to submit comments to accommodate anyone that does not have a computer at home.
Yeah, in fact, I would say it's not a recommendation. It is one of the requirements in the executive orders that there be a publicly accessible place that's ADA compliant, so that someone who wished could still engage in hearing the content that's being presented and being able to present their own comments and thoughts to the decision makers when that hearing's going on. So that is a requirement that is required to be covered by the executive order.
Thanks, Dan. Now we have a question for Daniel Friedman. What is the best way to figure out a process for communication for a team? Are there best practices when it comes to this?
It's a great and vast question about how teams can figure out communication strategies. There's so much that's been written about communication in non-remote teams, ranging from nonviolent communication approaches to traditional business and organizational management approaches for communication. And I think that part of the secret is taking the approaches that you're already familiar with and just seeing what generalizes, what parts don't rely on the remoteness or not, and then be aware of which parts of communication are evergreen. What are the aspects of communication, like speaking clearly or asking if somebody heard a message, that are especially important in a remote context? And also, what are some of the new challenges? For example, body language is such a large fraction of communication day to day in person, and it's tempting to use body language or vocal cues in an online context. However, the person who you're talking to might have lag or difficulty perceiving your messages as well. So I think it comes back down to the fundamentals, which are just communicating clearly and professionally, and then whatever else can be done, just treating it as an eternal learning process.
Thanks, Daniel. Dan Cucci, we have one more for you. Can you clarify the requirement that there be a place for individuals to participate in the meeting and how to still observe social distancing?
I think they're raising the, I wouldn't call it a flaw, but it's sort of a fly in the ointment of the executive order by the governor. And it's the issue of you must do this and have it available, but you also probably, in order to comply with this sort of, the social distancing requirements, you may need it to be as maybe a large room where you set out a few chairs that are all at least 6 feet apart, signaling to everyone that this is what the process and the system you're setting up to do. And so, on some level, we're all still trying to figure it out. And remember that our order actually came down prior to the stay-at-home order stuff. So it's sort of the dynamic is, what we've implemented and when, and everything's sort of ever-changing. I think, the best you can do is just try to set up an environment that encourages the social distancing, much like you see in the stores that you can visit right now. Say your Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever your type of place that you're visiting. You'll notice they have a lot of tape and other things to try to essentially encourage that kind of stuff. That's what I would do.
Thanks, Dan. Tom, do you anticipate problems with exercising disciplinary procedures in the light of current civil service HR regulations? Given the unfortunate, embarrassing situation with the Vallejo Planning Commission last week, how will we handle that in the future?
Well, I always try to remind staff in the public sector to treat all of your communications as things that could be displayed on a billboard. Make sure that you're always comfortable, whatever you say, however you present yourself, whatever people see, and whatever is being kept on record or stored in any form, that potentially is a public record for employees of public agencies. And so I hope that that does not become a problem that I have to face. And so far it hasn't been an issue. I think as planners, we should certainly be focusing on our professional ethics and performing our duties in a way that doesn't create a problem for that type of situation. So far, I'm not aware of any complaints or concerns with the performance of any of my staff, or none of my managers have told me that they've heard any complaints either, and they don't seem to have complaints given that nearly all of my staff were working from home. The city of Sacramento has just under 5,000 employees, and right now in the entire city, we have about 1,600 of them who are remote working. So it's about a third of all city employees, but nearly all of the employees in the community development department are telecommuting. So it's been working really, for a lot of us, I would say surprisingly well.
Thanks, Tom. This one was not specified for a specific presenter, but how can we get an extension or waiver for the Permit Streamlining Act?
I think that would be great for Dan Cucci, and then maybe Tom.
I raised this issue. It is an issue, and basically it's in statute. As you've seen, the governor has some authority to waive or modify certain sort of standards and requirements under his emergency authority, and that's what he's been using to do a lot of these executive orders. So really sort of the takeaway is that people believe that the only person who can do so is the governor. And there are a lot of agencies who are already trying to do that, exactly that. We've had, like I said, I am fully aware that the League of Cities has drafted a letter on behalf of all their member agencies requesting some relief from that. My understanding is that California APA, the statewide organization, has done something as well. And I imagine some of the others like CSAC have done so. And so the hope is that Governor Newsom will hear it out and consider adopting some sort of relief given the complexity and timing. But again, I still believe that, you don't have to wait for the state to do some things that can help clear your plate. If you have the political wherewithal to try to figure out, are there things that we don't really need to be spending so much time on to hold hearings and process the way that we used to, because just sort of the way we did it. You can always think about things. God, I do these things all the time. Nobody ever comments. Nobody ever does anything. But yet we're still, holding some sort of hearing. You could consider maybe adopting a short-term ordinance that, makes it a, say maybe a planning director decision. So at least then people can comment and they can just sort of move forward and, and try to clear some of that stuff off your plate and make it easier to deal with the projects that you can't really do that with.
I'd like
Thanks,
to add.
Dan. Oh, go ahead.
The city of Sacramento is taking this approach right now. Our view is that we're facing some economic uncertainty. We're seeing a reduction in revenues. And so we'd actually like to encourage development activity and business activity that's consistent with our plans. And so rather than extending the amount of time we take to approve things, we're trying to figure out how we can reduce the amount of time, even while we're operating in a different way. So just recently, last week, our commission reviewed an ordinance that would provide some of the type of streamlining that Dan was just describing by delegating certain decisions from commission level to director level, and also removing certain conditional use permit requirements and allowing those uses to be approved by right. So we hope this will help with economic recovery and also with the serious housing deficiency that we face.
Thanks, Tom. Daniel, notice the inclusion of Jitsi on the handout. The combination of no download and no account requirements seems useful for quick calls. Is there more information on it?
Sure. Jitsi is an open source and secure platform that we reference in our handout. And in contrast to a lot of these other video conferencing software, on a desktop or a laptop computer, Jitsi doesn't require anything other than the regular plugins that, for example, run a YouTube video. It does have a smartphone application. It's a really nice alternative because it's free. It doesn't require accounts of any kind. So you can just make a URL like jitsi.com/ and then the meeting. All the details are in our handout, and that can allow a password or not. And I think it's always good to consider open source alternatives and ones that have very low barriers to entry. For example, no account needed or accessible on multiple platforms, because those are just key topics that a lot of people brought up today.
Thank you, Daniel. And I think what might lead us to our final question, depending on the answer. Dan, I have a question for Dan regarding the Judicial Council Emergency Rule 9. I understand that the statute of limitations is extended, but it does not address appeals at the local level or suspending the need to exhaust all administrative remedies, so that secret litigation could be filed without exhausting all remedies through appeals. And what have you locally?
So the Judicial Council's emergency rule only relates to filing of litigation. So in order to have a successful lawsuit, you need to have gotten your ducks in a row at the administrative level. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't file, but of course, the agency would have really strong defense if you fail to exhaust remedies. So there's sort of two separate things, and the Judicial Council's rule doesn't really affect that. So to the extent that an agency has a process that is still available to an opponent to a project, they would still need to complete all their remedies at the administrative level before they could file suit. Now, perhaps if your agency, for one reason or another, essentially has sort of cut that off under these circumstances, that they probably could make a credible argument that they did exhaust their remedies if they did whatever was available to them, even if they couldn't, that there was some sort of barrier to filing an appeal. I can see a really credible claim there, but that's what it would require, that the agency doesn't really have a process for them to go through on the administrative level.
And I actually have one final question, and then we'll have answered all questions received so far. Is the state, and it wasn't specified to who, is the state looking at extensions of housing element upcoming deadlines?
Dan, do you want to take that first, and then I think Wendy, it sounds like you want to answer that as well.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything, so I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, we haven't heard anything either. All of our housing experts, we've been tracking it, and we keep trying to catch our, leads there to see if we can get any hints. But at this point, we're marching forward like the same thing with BMT. Nothing's changed.
Yeah, sounds like there's lots more to look forward to as the planning field continues to continuously adapt and demonstrate resiliency as we always have. Thank you so much, Jenny, for handling the question and answer portion. Thank you so much to our panelists. At this time, we are at the 2 o'clock hour, and I want to be respectful of our attendees' time. Thank you so much for participating. We will be following up shortly with the recording. I do want to make a final plug, both at the state and section level. If you are not a member of APA California, please consider becoming a member. We provide a lot of great content, such as the webinar for today, and there's a lot of other wonderful resources available to those who are members. Until next time, thank you all, be safe and stay well.
Thank you. And just one quick update, the remote or the recording will be available on the APA-CA website and possibly also on the SVS website after end of day tomorrow.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you all, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.